So welcome to today's webinar on the Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. My name's Emma Stewart. I'm the Carbon Markets Project Manager at the Forestry Commission in England. And also with me today are Chris Waterfield, who is the Forestry Commission's Carbon and Water Advisor, and Andy Baker, who is the UK Woodland Carbon Markets Advisor at Scottish Forestry. So we've put this webinar together just as an introductory session, really, to the Woodland Carbon Code and the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So it's going to be most relevant to those people who have maybe heard of these schemes before, but want to understand more about it and what exactly it's used for and how it works. So if you're planning on creating new woodland and are thinking about potential income from carbon, or if you're working with others who are interested in carbon income, today's webinar will provide you with the need-to-know information to get a woodland creation project registered and benefit from the extra revenue stream. So it's going to be pretty comprehensive and there's quite a lot to get through, but please do pop your questions in the chat and we will answer them as we go through. So as I said, we're recording this session and we will share the link for anyone who couldn't make it today, or if you just want to watch it back. So we've got 2 hours. The first hour is going to be about the Woodland Carbon Code. Then we'll have a short break. Andy will come in to talk about additionality. And finally, Chris is going to come in at the end to talk about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So just a quick run through of what we will be looking at. So I'll start with the context for the Woodland Carbon Code, just setting the scene a little bit. The role of the Woodland Carbon Code, who is involved, so who the key players are. I'll talk a bit about the eligibility requirements, so what projects have to do to register with the code. And then moving on to some of the more technical bits, so how it works, the process for validation and verification. I'll do a demo of the Woodland Carbon Calculator spreadsheet, and then we'll go through costs, buying and selling carbon units, and just talk a bit about the current market. So just starting out by setting the scene a little. So we've got UK government who have set a target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. That is laid out in the Climate Change Act, so that makes it legally binding. And we have a number of different policy documents that address the net zero target and the role that Woodland has to play in achieving it. I won't go through everything, but just to mention a couple of the main ones. We've got the Climate Change Committee, so they have recommended planting 30,000 hectares of woodland per year across the UK for the carbon sequestration benefits. And then we have the UK Clean Growth Strategy and the 25-year Environment Plan. So they both set out targets for woodland creation and also talk about government's role in supporting the development of a private carbon offset market. So the intention behind that is to provide greater confidence really to the private sector just to help the market grow. So carbon neutrality. Companies are investing in becoming carbon neutral. They might even talk about becoming carbon negative. So that means that their emissions of carbon are less than zero. So they're offsetting more carbon than they're contributing to the environment. But the point here really is that working towards, at the very least, a carbon reduction target is becoming increasingly important to companies. It's voluntary for them to do so. They don't have to do it, but it is good for business. And since April 2019, all publicly listed companies and all large companies, so that's companies with at least 500 employees, have been required by law to publicly report on their greenhouse gas emissions. So doing that enables customers and investors to understand much better how an organisation performs in response to the climate crisis, and it's really just something that is factoring more and more into their decision making. So it's only mandated for large companies, but smaller businesses are putting carbon targets in place as well. So to achieve carbon neutrality, the first thing that a company has to do is to reduce its emissions as far as possible. But there will be some that they just can't get rid of. And the emissions that they can't stop are known as unavoidable emissions. And so to account for those, they have to buy carbon offsets from projects that take carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's where the voluntary carbon market comes in. So carbon units are generated from projects that sequester. which essentially means absorb carbon from the atmosphere, Woodland being such a type of project. And I'll talk a bit later on in a bit more detail about the carbon unit specific to the Woodland Carbon Code. But companies can buy these units and use them to compensate for the unavoidable emissions in their operations so that they can achieve their carbon targets. But what they want to be sure of is that what they're buying is high quality and will actually be offsetting their emissions. You're probably familiar with the term greenwash. So these are things, the positive things that companies say about their operations in regards to the environment, but they just don't hold up to scrutiny, and they really want to avoid that. So they need to make sure that they're investing their money in credible projects and not into a project that doesn't actually remove any carbon from the atmosphere. And this is where the Woodland Carbon Code comes in. So firstly, what is it? So it's the UK's government-backed voluntary carbon standard for woodland creation projects. It was launched in 2011, so it's been going for just over 10 years, and it means that buyers of carbon units can be confident that the woodland creation projects that are registered with the code are high quality and meet high standards. So it describes what is required from a woodland creation project, and it means that the landowner can sell the carbon that the woodland sequesters. It's endorsed by CROA, which is the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance. So the carbon sequestration from Woodland Carbon Code verified projects will also contribute to the UK's national targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It is very high integrity and it's well regarded. So the units are in really high demand. We actually often get asked by people where they can get units from. But ultimately what it's for is to help organisations to achieve their carbon targets, as well as helping the UK meet its national net zero target, as well as being an extra incentive for woodland creation, because it adds extra income for landowners from their projects. And that's even after grant maintenance payments have finished. So who is involved? The Secretariat for the Woodland Carbon Code sits within Scottish Forestry. So that's on behalf of all the other nations in the UK. Otherwise, we've got the landowners, so those who create new woodland and register it with the code for the carbon income. We have project developers, so organisations that can help to develop a landowner's woodland project and prepare the documentation for validation and verification with an accreditor. Validation and verification, I'm going to talk through them a bit later on and the process for them, but essentially they are to check how much carbon the project expects to sequester. So that's the start of the project, that's validation. And then later on, how much it is actually sequestered, verification. There are 2 UK Accreditation Society approved accreditors, the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers, and either one of them can validate or verify the project. And then finally, we have the buyers of carbon units, so the companies with a carbon target who want to buy the units to compensate for their unavoidable emissions. So what does a woodland creation project have to do? So firstly, they have to register with the Woodland Carbon Code before the work starts on site. That's called the project implementation date, and projects can't register with the Woodland Carbon Code if they've already started work. So that might be fencing or deer control or ground prep or planting. If any of that's done, it'll be too late to register. The project must be a permanent land use change to woodland. It has to be compliant with the UK Forestry standard. As with all forestry projects, it has to abide by the Forestry Act. So if there are any plans for tree felling, they need a felling licence. And it must also comply with the Environmental Impact Assessment, EIA regulations, if they're applicable. So if you apply for a Forestry Commission grant, an EIA assessment will be done. If you're not, you have to apply separately to the Forestry Commission for its EIA approval. The final point, additionality, is a really, really important concept to the Woodland Carbon Code. So we've got Andy here especially to talk about it in a bit more detail later on in the webinar. But essentially what it means is that the project needs carbon financing to make it happen. Otherwise, it would have happened anyway. So there are two tests to make sure that a project is additional. The first one is a legal test. So planting must not be a legal requirement to compensate for development or open habitat restoration. And the second is an investment test. So proving that either A, forestry is not the most economically or financially attractive option on that piece of land, or B, without carbon financing, the project wouldn't have been able to go ahead at all. So it has to pass both of these tests to be eligible for registration. But we've got Andy to talk about that a bit more later on, so we'll just park that one for now. Just a couple of things I want to mention that landowners should be aware of if they want to register with the Woodland Carbon Code. Firstly, and probably most importantly, you should be aware that you have to replant in the case of catastrophe. So for example, if there's a fire at some point after the project starts and the woodland burns down, if you're registered with the Woodland Carbon Code, you have to replant that woodland. It can't be left down to natural regeneration. So you can get insurance and manage the woodland to in such a way to minimize those risks, but it's just something to be aware of. Secondly, you have to verify the project at least every 10 years. So that means getting an accreditor in to check that the carbon has been sequestered, which has costs associated with it. You have to manage the project as outlined in the initial carbon calculations and management plan. And then the final point is that you may potentially have to buy back the units. So if you've sold all of them, but there was some sort of catastrophe at some point throughout the woodland's lifespan, which meant that you weren't able to generate as much carbon as you initially predicted, that will mean that you have to buy back the units that you've already sold. So that's just a couple of things that landowners should be aware of and consider really before they sign up. So how does it work? The Woodland Carbon Code is based on science from forest research. It uses a carbon model developed using their data, and that allows us to predict the amount of carbon that a woodland will sequester, and we can do that up to 100 years. So we do have an Excel file on the Woodland Carbon Code website that uses the model, so you can download it from there, and it just allows you to input your details about your project and estimate the amount of carbon it will sequester, and therefore the number of carbon units that you can generate from it. So I'm going to run through a demo of that just a bit later on. From the chart on the right here, you can see that carbon sequestration is greater in the first 20 years or so after planting. So after that point, the rate of sequestration slows down a bit. So this is factored into the carbon model, and it's just to say really that the length of the project there is relevant. I've talked about carbon units throughout the presentation, but here I'm just going to explain a bit more about them because it's a really important aspect to understand about the Woodland Carbon Code. So the units are the sellable things in the Woodland Carbon Code. So 1 unit representing 1 tonne of carbon. But the carbon isn't sequestered straight away because it takes time for woodland to grow. And so that's why there are 2 different types of units. Pending issuance units, PIUs, and woodland carbon units, WCUs. So a PIU is effectively a promise to deliver a tonne of carbon at some point in the future. It's not yet guaranteed, and it can't be used to report against a company's emissions, but companies can buy PIUs and use them in their plans to account for their future emissions. A WCU is a tonne of carbon which has been sequestered in a Woodland Carbon Code verified woodland. So PIUs will be converted into WCUs once that's been confirmed. And companies can use those WCUs in their carbon accounting because they are proof that the carbon has been sequestered by the woodland. So at the very start of a project, when it's first validated and the total number of PIUs is calculated, all the PIUs are assigned a vintage year. So that's when they are expected to be delivered and converted into WCUs. So if you think about this from the perspective of a company, so if I was a company, I will have calculated the total unavoidable emissions that I want to compensate for to reach my carbon reduction target. And so then I have to buy carbon units that will allow me to get there. So when a company sets an emissions reduction target, there will always be a date by when they want to achieve that. So they need to make sure that they're buying units that work to that timescale. So 2050, for example, is a very popular date for carbon neutrality. So when I as a company buy PRUs, I want to know what the vintage is so that I can know when they'll be converted into WCUs, and then therefore when I can use them in my carbon accounting. So if the vintage is after 2050, I'll probably be less interested in buying those because they won't be able to contribute towards my target. If WCUs are available for purchase, they will be more attractive to me because I can use them in my carbon accounting straight away if I want to. But there just are not as many of those available yet because only a small number have been verified so far since the Woodland Carbon Code launched. So just to go over that again, a PRU is a promise to sequester a ton of carbon. And once time has passed and once the woodland has grown, a verification process happens, and that allows the PRUs to be converted into WCUs. And so then they can be used to compensate for a company's unavoidable emissions. So I've mentioned validation and verification already. And so now I just want to talk through the process a bit more. So this image here sums up quite nicely what happens. So firstly, the landowner must register their project with the carbon code before planting. And then they submit their project documents to either of the two validators. And you can download all the documents from the Woodland Carbon Code website. And if they need or if they want to employ a project developer, they can get them to help them with that. The validator audits the project against the Woodland Carbon Code, and that has to be completed within 3 years of the project implementation date. All validations are checked by the Secretariat, by the Woodland Carbon Code Secretariat. And once done, the PRUs are listed on the UK Land Carbon Registry, and that is where all the Woodland Carbon Code units are listed and tracked. An important thing to point out here is that 20% of PRUs are taken from a project as a buffer, and they're added to a pool when the project is validated. The buffer PRUs can't be sold, and that's to protect investors, investors or buyers. The reason being that there is a risk of loss of the woodland through catastrophe, so through fire or pest and disease or for some other reason. So by taking a buffer of PRUs from all projects, it safeguards the investment made by the buyer. There are always enough buffer units in the pool to account for any unanticipated losses. Then 5 years after planting, the project is ready for its first verification. The organisations that verify are the same as the ones who validate. So the two that I mentioned earlier, the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers. Again, the Secretariat checks all verifications, and all the units on the verification statement can be converted into WCUs on the UK Land Carbon Registry. And then subsequent verifications will operate in the same way, at least every 10 years. So I just want to pause there just to take any questions that you might have. I will come back after this and demo the spreadsheet for you, but if there are any questions that anyone has at the moment, fire away.
There have been quite a few in the chat. Andy, I'm wondering if you could answer Andy Weatherall's question. If you convert a PRU to a WCU after just 5 years, that suggests to me that carbon losses with the tree establishment, except perhaps through natural colonisation, are not fully accounted for.
It's an important question, Andrew. More often than not, you find that you're not actually sequestering any carbon, not actually converting any PRUs until about year 15, because you've got that what's known as a carbon debt from not only the soil emissions from ploughing or whatever it may have been, but also from the carbon emissions associated with fencing and tree tubes and all of that. That's all accounted for. So that carbon debt usually takes 10 to 15 years to pay off. So if you do have WCUs being generated in year 5, it's more likely because you've had a very low intervention ground preparation technique and some fast growing trees as well. There are some quite other, there are loads of questions, which is brilliant, and some of them are really good. Emma, one of the questions was just about, a minimum size. I don't know if you had, talking about grouping of schemes and stuff. I don't know if you wanted to explain just a bit how that works, might drive the prices down a bit.
Yeah, so there's no minimum size to enter into the Woodland Carbon Code, but for smaller schemes, because there are costs associated with validation and verification, it might make more sense to group together with other smaller projects. So that will help you save on some of the validation and verification costs. I do have a little illustration of maybe what to expect for costs a bit later on in the presentation, but that is an option if your project is a bit smaller.
Excellent. Kate has a question. Kate Winters has a question, which is, could you say a little bit more about the buffer pool? Is it per project or is it shared across the registry?
Yep, so the buffer pool is taken from every project. So it's 20% PRUs are taken from every project that registers with the code, and then they are added to the pool. So if anything happens to someone's project, the investor knows that they can still get the carbon as they planned, just maybe not from the project they initially understood it was coming from.
Great stuff.
Yeah, sorry, Chris.
Go on, Andy.
Good man. Just to say, there's one from Katie Langdon as well, just talking about, can you claim for carbon credits if you use natural colonisation as a method of tree establishment, whether that's UCO or otherwise? Emma, I didn't know if you wanted to jump on that one or.
So natural colonisation is part of the Woodland Carbon Code. It's unlikely that you'll be able to claim as many units from it. There's just less information about it. Our understanding of it is not as good as it is for managed woodlands, but it is an option, and you can include that in the carbon calculation spreadsheet that I'll show you later. But yeah, you just won't be able to generate as many units from it.
Particularly up front, just to add to that as well, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's about how much understanding we have, and natural colonisation and regeneration is such a broad term to account for. Some natural regeneration can grow like weeds that can grow crazy, and then some takes a long time. So it's that initial assignment, isn't it, Emma, when we're looking at, right, we're predicting how many carbon units this woodland is going to sequester, and therefore the number of PRUs we'll give to you up front. Well, we're quite confident in our understanding of 2 meter spacing, X, Y, or Z species, whereas when it comes to natural regeneration, we don't have that confidence. But that being said, if you come to year 5, year 10, year 15 verification, and your trees are growing fantastically well, if we've predicted 200 units per hectare, and you're showing us, well, no, that's wrong, I'm at 600 units per hectare, we will give you those extra units. So if your natural regeneration scheme is growing fantastically well, you will be rewarded for that. We're just quite conservative on the assignments of units up front.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And that's part of the reason, I guess, why verification is such a regular thing as well. So we can check and give more WCUs if they're there.
Absolutely. I don't know, Chris, did you want to jump on now and then come back to some more questions later on, or?
Yeah, I think we'll move on now. There's been some great questions in the chat, which we will look to answer as we go along. But Emma, carry on. We'll both go off mic and camera, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, guys. So just bear with me a second. I'm just going to share my screen again. So hopefully now you can see a spreadsheet. Hopefully it doesn't look too scary. It will look less, if it does look scary, it will look less scary after I've gone through it. This is the carbon calculation spreadsheet, and this is what you can download from the Woodland Carbon Code website. This is where you input your information about your project to figure out how much carbon you'll sequester and how many units you can generate. So you input information about your project into these blue cells. And once you've input it all, it will tell you how many units you can generate. So I'm just going to run through it and explain what to put in each of these cells. So we start with the project basics. So this section here, I'll just zoom in a bit actually if it's in case it's not quite clear. So you start by putting in your project start date, then your project duration in years. So as I said, we can predict or we can estimate carbon anywhere up to 100 years. You probably usually not have anything less than 30 because you're not going to be sequestering that much carbon before then.
Sorry, Emma, just to jump in quickly, it seems a few people can't see the spreadsheet. Do you want to just unshare and then reshare again? That can often sort it, if that's okay.
Sure.
And if that is everyone, it's hard to tell with the meeting this big, isn't it? It seems as though there's only a couple of people. Yeah, you and there's most people I think can see it okay. It's just a couple, so.
Okay.
And this will be recorded, so even if you haven't seen it, just in this bit, it's only, yeah, most people. Oh, it's on a Mac. I don't know if that makes a difference.
Okay.
But still, it's going
Andy,
to be recorded, isn't it? So.
If you have a link handy to the spreadsheet, just that you can.
I can see. I can see it, Emma. So I think for most people it should be fine. So
okay.
it should be fine.
Emma too.
Yeah, you carry on and then. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, guys. So anywhere if you anywhere up to 100 years, but just bearing in mind that if the longer the project, the more the longer that you have to maintain the adherence to the Woodland Carbon Code, and then you'll have to keep verifying, etc. The total net planting area. So I've just put in 100 hectares here for ease for demonstration, but just to note that that is excluding open space. The country, so which UK country you're in. So you've got a drop down here for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. If you're in England, you have the option of using the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So Chris is going to talk in a bit more detail about that later on. Again, it's just a drop down here for yes or no if you are using the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. And then you just need to let us know if you are verifying or if you're planning on verifying every 10 years or every 5 years. So scroll down to the next section. So this section here is about the emissions from the establishment of the woodland. So that's really about the carbon that is released throughout that process. So there are going to be some emissions associated with the woodland being created in the first place. And that has to be paid back through the growth of the woodland before you can start generating units. So you just want to put in the information about your seedlings. So your spacing. Spacing is just your average spacing for all your seedlings across your project. And then the area, the total area. So we've got 100 hectares here. Ground preparation. So this is referring to the machines that you use for ground prep. So if you're mounding or ploughing or mowing, that kind of thing, those machines use fuel. And so you put in the hectareage over which you are preparing your site in that way. And that will estimate the carbon from the fuel used. Then we have tree shelters. So we don't, there's no distinction between different types of tree shelters in the Woodland Carbon Code. So you just put the total area that you're planning on using tree shelters on. Next is fencing. At the moment, we don't have data for fencing by meter. So we do this by hectares as well. So just put in the total area that you will be fencing.
Need a pasty.
Hopefully soon we will have data. So in an update before long, we will be able to change that to meters. Finally, we have herbicide. So the way to think about this is the number of times that you're spraying herbicide over your site and the area over which you're doing that. So in this example, we've got 100 hectares and we're thinking of spraying a few times. So if we spray 3 times in the first year, twice in the second year, and once in the third year, that's 6 times, and 6 times 100, 600. So you pop 600 hectares in here. Then we move down to roads, and this is to include any roads built before before you planted, and any roads that you plan on building afterwards. It's in kilometres. You might not know exactly the length of road that you will be building, so just estimate as best as you can. If you are planting a particularly large scheme and you don't put anything in here, we would probably flag that up, as it would be quite unusual. Moving down, we also want to know about whether you are removing trees or other vegetation before you start the project. So if you are removing vegetation, that will contribute to a loss of carbon. If you are doing that, you just need to get in touch with the Secretariat for another spreadsheet to calculate it in. So you can just email them, the email address is on the website, and they'll send it back through to you. And once you've done that, just pop that area in here. And then once you've input all these figures, that will give you the total emissions from the establishment. So you think of this as kind of like a carbon debt that you have to pay back. Next, these 3 blue cells here, you are quite unlikely to use, but I'll just run through them anyway, just so you know. So this first one wants to know about soil carbon accumulation. So it's asking, if previously arable site on mineral soil, over what area are you claiming soil carbon sequestration? So it's really asking whether you are planting on arable soil that was previously ploughed for agricultural use, and then you're using a non-intervention ground prepping technique now. So if that's what you're doing, you can actually claim the saved carbon from what would have been emitted through the agricultural activity, because you're stopping that activity happening by planting trees instead. So if you're planting on an arable area and you're not doing any significant ground prep, then put that area in here, and that will actually generate some extra units for you. Finally, baseline and leakage. These will usually be no. They're just a drop down. But baseline is essentially saying that if you didn't plant trees, would the current land use be sequestering more carbon, which is unlikely. So just pop a no in here. And leakage, that means that by planting the woodland, you're enabling deforestation elsewhere. So we have legislation against that in the UK, so it's unlikely that this will ever be yes. This next section is just some very basic details, so the project name, your name, and the date that the calculation was completed. And then if you just scroll down to the next section, is this one here about land use and soil assumptions. So again, we've got a drop down for you to put in the previous land use. Then we'll ask you about the soil type. So whether that's mineral or organomineral, again, that's a drop down. By mineral, we mean anything up to 5 centimeters organic material. Organomineral is anything between 5 and 45 or 50. And it's 45 or 50 because the definition varies by each nation in the UK. Anything over 45 or 50 will be organic, so you wouldn't be planting on that. Another drop down for the disturbance or /site preparation. So anything from negligible disturbance all the way up to very high disturbance. And then the area over which you are preparing the site in that way. So just complete that for the whole site, and then it will add up to the area that you've input at the top. And then that will add to your carbon debt a little bit. So next you scroll up to the top here, and here we are looking at your species, your spacing, and your yield class. So you've got this column here to pop in the section number. That can be your compartment number if you want to add it in, but you don't really need to worry about that too much, but you can just pop it in if you want to. The next column is about your species, so which species you're planting. We've got a very long drop down here, so you can choose which one. The actual spacing that you are planning on planting at. And then the next column that you need to fill in is the spacing used in the lookup tables. So this is from the model. So the model only caters to certain spacing. And so you just select from the drop down the closest one to what you've put in here. Next, we look at yield class. So you can find out the yield class using the Ecological Site Classification Tool, or ESC. And that is a tool. You can just go to another website, the ESC website, and it will tell you what your yield class in. You just put in your location and use the future climate scenario model, and that will tell you what your yield class is. There is guidance on the Woodland Carbon Code website about how to do that. Again, the model uses certain yield classes. Those are already preset into the model. So just pick the closest one again. But just to point out that for these drop downs in the model, always be conservative because you don't want to over predict the number of carbon units that your project is going to generate. Next, this section is just the last part that you need to fill in. So we're just interested in knowing about how you're planning on managing your woodland. So there are two options in this column here. So whether you're planning on thinning or not thinning at all. And then you put in the area of the woodland that you are planning on managing in that way. So 20% of this species is being, or 20% of the area for this species is being managed in that way. And that will calculate the total area for you. So there's a little formula in here to do that for you. And then finally, you just want to put in if you are planning on clear felling. So if you are planning on thinning or clear felling, that is going to reduce the number of carbon units in the scheme because the Woodland Carbon Code can only account for the carbon that is sequestered within the woodland block. So it doesn't account for harvested wood products, anything like that. So if you're thinning and clear felling, it's been removed from the system and it's not accounted for. So if you're clear felling, just pop the age at which you are planning on doing that. So we've put 40 years in here. And if you scroll down to the bottom, once you've done that for all of your species, then hopefully it should add up to 100% and the hectareage that you've popped in at the bottom. And that's everything you need to put in. So those are all the inputs. If you scroll along to the right after you've done that, you get this section here. So this is really just for your information only. And it just tells you about how you get from your inputs on this side to your outputs on this side. So this is where you will see, this is where you'll see this section here, how many units you're generating. So in total, this scheme is generating 81,294 PIUs. 20% of those go into the buffer, and then you are left with 65,035 PIUs that you can then do what you like with. You can sell them on. So that is the carbon calculation spreadsheet. Hopefully that's cleared things up for you if you've not been sure about it. This tab here, so if you just look, there's a few tabs along the bottom. We use this tab for larger schemes, so schemes over 5 hectares. But if you have a smaller scheme under 5 hectares, then we have a small project carbon calculator as well. So I'm just going to switch back to the presentation. So now moving on to costs. So there are costs associated with the Woodland Carbon Code, both for projects and for buyers. So for projects, it's free to register with the UK Land Carbon Registry, and that is where all the units are listed, all the carbon units are listed, whereas buyers of units have to pay a registration fee. So it's £400 for private companies or £200 for government and charities. Validation, so that's a cost for a project. You only have to validate once, and that's right at the beginning. Current costs are around £1,100 to £1,400 per project. But as I said, it is possible to group projects together, and particularly for smaller projects, this will be This will make it more attractive really because it reduces the cost to validate. So maybe looking between £300 to £800 per grouped project. There is a fee of 5p to issue each PRU to the UK Land Carbon Registry. And there is a levy payable to the Woodland Carbon Code of 5p per unit as well. Verification, so that, as I mentioned, that happens at 5 years and then at least every 10 years afterwards. So at the moment, we're looking at £1,600 to £2,100 per project, or £300 to £1,000 per grouped project. And then there is also a fee to convert each PRU to a WCU, so 5p per unit. So how are units bought and sold? There isn't a marketplace as such where you can just go and see what's for sale. So buyers and sellers have to engage with one another directly. So it's not always easy to find carbon units if you're looking for them. But if a company is looking for units, then they may already have links with a project that they can buy them from. If not, they can find them via a project developer. And the Woodland Carbon Code website has a list of developers that they can get in touch with to buy their units. And as a landowner, project developers can help you find buyers for your units as well. There's also the possibility of looking through the UK Land Carbon Registry, where all the units are listed, but you have to create an account, and as I just said, you have to pay to create an account. But there you can see who has units for sale, and you might want to ask agents for help as well. So what affects the value of the carbon units? It can really depend on what the buyer is looking for, and what units sell for varies massively. It depends on lots of different factors. So the vintage is going to be really important to buyers. So if a unit has a vintage after 2050, so as I mentioned earlier, that's a target year for lots for carbon neutrality. We might expect it to sell for a lower price than one that has a vintage before 2050 or up to 2050, because they can use that in their carbon accounting. Buyers might also be interested in the type of woodland creation project, so what other benefits it provides as well. And I've put in the image on the right here just to describe some of the other potential benefits from a woodland. You can generate this yourself through the Woodland Benefits tool, and that's one of the documents that landowners have to submit when they register with the Woodland Carbon Code. It presents the likely environmental outcomes of their projects, and so it can help to kind of demonstrate to buyers what they are. So for example, buyers might be interested in creating a woodland near communities for the social benefits that provides. They might be interested in location as well, because if they want to give employees or clients the opportunity to be part of the planting, that might be attractive to them. So the buyer's interests really vary, and that can have an impact on the price that units sell for as well. So finally, just finishing up with the current market. So what is going on at the moment in the current market? So just want to give you an idea of what landowners might be able to generate from their project. As I said, it really varies. Anecdotally, we are aware of units going for maybe between £10 and £25 upwards for each unit. And then depending on the woodland, so the species, the yield class, the length of the project, all these different factors, that will affect how many units are generated per hectare. So as an example here, between 100 and 500. If we extrapolate that, we are looking at potentially anywhere between £1,000 per hectare and £12,500 plus. So it really varies, and that is just to say that's on the private market, but landowners in England can also sell their units back to government through the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So we'll hear a bit more from Chris about that later. And then I'm just going to wrap up with some of the statistics that we've recently published on the Woodland Carbon Code website. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at them, because it gives you a good idea of what's kind of going on at the moment. These figures here are from the UK Land Carbon Registry. It was last updated on the 30th of June. And so you can see here that you've got PRUs on the top and WCUs on the bottom. So you've got over 6 million tonnes of carbon expecting to be sequestered. So those are the PRUs through validated projects, and almost 12,000 tonnes already sequestered. If you look over to the left, you can see that more units have already been sold than haven't been sold. So that reflects the demand, but just to kind of touch on these units available for sale. So the very first column there, just because they're available for sale, you might not be able to buy them straight away. Sellers might be holding back some PRUs for a sale at a later time to balance out their income over a few years, or they might want to wait for a better price or be waiting for them to be converted into WCUs. So they might just not be available for purchase right away. Here we can just see the growth in the number of projects registered over the last few years. So sorry that the colours are different. So comparing and contrasting might be a bit difficult, but really I just want to show you that the number of projects over the last 3 years has really grown, and just demonstrates the popularity of the scheme. These charts give you an idea of the size and distribution of the projects that we have registered. So on the left, we have the number of projects by nation. Scotland's just ahead of England here. But then on the right, you can see that the size of the projects in Scotland is much, much bigger than in England. So it's about 50,000 hectares in total in Scotland, compared to just under 8,000 in England. So Scottish projects are just on a much larger scale. But what it also demonstrates is that, as we can see from England, small projects are still relevant to the Woodland Carbon Code. As I said, they can group together to save on validation and verification costs. And we are seeing prices rising as well. So it's making smaller projects more viable. But yeah, so those are just a few of the stats that are on the Woodland Carbon Code website. So do go and have a look and just see how things are working. And so just to wrap up, why should woodland creation projects register with the code? Firstly, it's free. Your project can't benefit from the Woodland Carbon Code if it's not registered. If your project is grant funded, it can also benefit from a future revenue stream beyond the time of the last grant payment, the last maintenance payment. If it's not registered with the Woodland Carbon Code when it's established, then there's no way for it to generate carbon units in the future. The carbon market is growing, and carbon pricing projections by BEIS are really promising. Agents might be expecting that carbon financing is going to become an increasingly important part of landowners' income, and people are probably going to be likely to ask more and more about it. As a landowner, if you're not feeling very confident about registering, there are agents and project developers to help. As a landowner, you can have confidence that your project is contributing to net zero. And then finally, you've got the Woodland Carbon Guarantee in England if as a landowner you are concerned about not being able to sell your units. And that's everything I have. So if there are any more questions, please do go ahead.
There are loads, Emma. There are loads. I don't think I've particularly helped you, Chris. I think I'm trying to answer questions you've already answered. It's very difficult to answer.
Don't worry about it.
At the same time as someone else.
There have been some good questions actually. One about how do you become a project developer? Andy, you might want to think about and answer that. And then what do project developers charge? How do they operate? So
yes,
you might know more about both of those.
Sure, yeah. So to become a project developer, you simply need to have a project that you are developing and submit your documentation to the market registry, now known as S&P Global. So the information for that is on our website, how to become a project developer. And I will give you, I'll put that in the link in the chat in a sec, so I can't do two things at once. But yeah, so you simply have to have a project that you're registering and submit all your documentation, sort of business information to market registry. How much they charge how long's the length of string? It depends on the project developer and it depends on what services they offer. One thing I've been meaning to do for a year has been to break down the project developers that are out there on our website in terms of the different services they can offer related to the Woodland Carbon Code, because as you can imagine, as Emma's outlined, the amount of different things that one needs support with or may need support with throughout this process, from setting up their account or project on the market registry, to actually planting the scheme, to register, to validating the project, to selling the units, all of these different parts. And there are very few project developers who can help you through the entire process. So you might have to use a couple of different types, or you can go it alone and do it all yourself. So as a general rule, there are certain fixed costs within the validation and verification process, and those aren't to the project developers, they're to the validators, the soil association or organic farms and growers. So for a single project on its own to get validated and then verified at year 5 and then every 10 years, it generally costs about £1.5 each time. However, and this is where people are saying, well, for smaller projects that might not work financially, you can group up to 50 hectares of small projects alongside 15 standard projects all together in a single group. And so that can bring the price per project for validation and verification to £100, £200 every 10 years, far more savvy. So it depends. And so the different parts of, so that's to the validators, and then some project developers will charge 100 quid or two to register your projects, might charge a bit more for a validation. Some might charge significantly more if it's a complex project. So it really does vary.
Great. And I think Kate Winters would like us to consider, please could you clarify the comment about if it's organic soil, you would not be planting on that. Andy. Or Emma.
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
You've got this. No, you sure, Emma? You can jump in on this one.
One of you, please.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, as per UK forestry standard, you shouldn't be planting on organic soil. And so that's really where that comment came from. But Andy, if you want to expand on that a bit more.
Sure. So essentially, it's based on the definitions of organic soil in the 4 different countries. Bear in mind, we are the UK Woodland Carbon Code, so that can be quite tricky because every country has a different definition, not only for the depth of soil, which means that it's organic, 45 centimetres, 50 centimetres, 30 centimetres of organic material. They also have different definitions of what is a woodland, 10 metres wide, 20 metres wide, this sort of spacing, etc., etc. So the organic soil one in particular, we're saying it must be, the depth of peat essentially must be no deeper than 50 centimetres to be able to plant on under the Woodland Carbon Code. However, if you're in a country that has tighter restrictions than that, you must adhere to that restriction. So if it was 45 centimetres, then you're not allowed. Even if we're saying 50 centimetres is okay, you have to defer to the local authority first. And one of the questions in the chat, I remember, was asking about the 3 metre spacing and how.
Sorry, Andy, before you go on, it's the country authority, not the local authority.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't know, are there local authorities, Chris, that have, you know better than me, are there local authorities that might be even tighter than the country authority?
England, no, there aren't local authorities devolved for forestry. The Forestry Commission makes decisions on competency on forestry, but yeah, there are differing levels of soil depth, carbon, organic soil depth in each of the countries of the UK, and they are being made and being revised and reviewed in the new UKFS that will come out next year. I think what we're going to do, I think there are lots of questions, and they're brilliant questions in the chat. What I'm going to say is that if we can't answer your question in the chat, then we'll give our email addresses in the chat later, and you can email us with your question. It's just sometimes the chat disappears after we've closed off the webinar, and we aren't able to answer through the chat again. But if we haven't answered you, because there are so many and they are scrolling past so quickly, then then that's what we'll do. I'm hoping that there was somebody who was on a Mac who was having difficulties looking and viewing the slides. So we will circulate the slides as well at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to get those out to everybody. Emma, am I right in thinking we're going to have a quick break now?
Break now, and then yeah, back for second half.
Break
Well,
now.
I'll just jump in
Oh.
quickly, Chris. Just now I mentioned the 3 meter spacing one. I can't remember who asked it, but essentially saying a lot of spacing for woodlands is far wider than that, up to 5 meters to be classed in the 400 stems per hectare, which is our definition of what is a woodland, 400 stems per hectare with the capacity to reach 20% canopy cover. And so that goes up to 5 meter spacing. So what we have is a limited set of yield models. You know, so when we're looking at the carbon calculator, you can see certain species have more spacings available, more yield classes available, and that's purely based on the information that we have from forest research. So it isn't comprehensive in its entirety. There are missing spots. So what we do, as a bit of a shoehorn, is we allow for effective area. So there's a calculation to say, right, okay, well, I'm saying in the calculator that I've got 5 hectares of oak that's planted at 3 meter spacing, even though it's only going to be 5 hectares of oak planted at 5 meter spacing. So what we do is we essentially use that 3 meter spacing model and then reduce down the area. So you've got a net area of 5 hectares, but you might actually have an effective area of 2 hectares or 3 hectares. And it's just our way of trying to address that difference in the amount of carbon that's actually going to be sequestered based on a wider spacing model. So it's not perfect, but as forest research continue to provide all their fantastic data to us, we can incorporate and are incorporating more and more options. So it is becoming more comprehensive as we go. As Chris says, we'll give you a 5-minute break now. Chris, Emma, what do you think? Come back at 11:05? Everyone have time for a tea and a wee?
That sounds good to me. 11:05, we'll start. Emma is popping off now, but Andy and I will be here till the end of the session. So thanks, Emma, and we'll see you again soon on one of these webinars. But back at 5 past, and hopefully you can all see and hear. Please, at the beginning of the session, if you cannot see us, then either raise your hand or try leaving and coming back in again.
Thanks a lot, Emma.
Thanks a lot.
In 5 minutes.
See you
Thanks,
all
everyone.
in 5 minutes.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
So again, a couple of minutes, guys. If anyone had any burning questions they wanted to jump in and turn the cameras on, then you can ask a question or just turn your mic on if you want. Otherwise, I'll just leave the ones in the chat until after my 20 minutes.
Ewan Nugent from Natural England has been asking about income and price.
Hey Chris,
Hi, Ewan.
how's it going? Yeah, have I got that sum right? Bearing in mind that was rubbish at maths and got an E or something like that, Chris. So where I was going was you that said that 1 hectare of broadleaf gets round about 400 WCUs over 100 years.
Yeah.
And Emma said between 10 and 25 quid per WCU currently. So I calculate that as being between 40 and 100 grand.
Over the whole project.
Yeah.
Over the whole project, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I could get that at year 5, but taking a risk. No, right, okay, that's
No. You'd get that, you could expect to earn that over the period of time. As if you sold them all at the beginning,
yeah,
you probably you might be able to make that at kind of as PIUs. But WCUs are the thing which you know, people sell. I think most or will be looking to sell the most in the future because they are sequestered carbon, and that comes in a kind of 5-yearly cycle. Andy, you could a bit more on.
And that just makes them more certain for the buyer then, Chris?
Yes.
Do we mean
so just splitting it between just to make clear, we're talking about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. They're the ones that you have to wait until year 5, potentially year 10, year 15 to sell the Woodland carbon units only, and that's up until 2055, 56. But Chris will go into the guarantee later. But in terms of the amount of money, if you've got a variety of options when you sell your units, you can sell all of them up front as PIUs. You could sell 50% of them as PIUs, the other 50% as WCUs. You could sell 20 today, 100 tomorrow. It's entirely up to you. They're a commodity that you sell. So a lot of people think of it as, oh, how much grant support am I getting? No, it's not a grant. It is purely a commodity to sell to these companies, and these companies determine the price they're willing to pay. Emma outlined a variety of factors affecting that price. But in reality, if I had a scheme that generated over 100 years, as you've got here, 4,000 units, and I sold all of those as PIUs up front, you could comfortably get £10 per unit for them now, selling those all up front. And so you've got the 40 grand there, and it's more likely to be quite a bit higher than that moving forwards. And Emma mentioned about BEIS, the government department looking at what the carbon price is predicted to be by 2025, 2030. You're looking at £100 to £300 per WCU by 2030. So this is the scale of the increase expected in these carbon prices. And there was someone mentioning earlier on about compliance market. If the Woodland Carbon Code went out of purely the voluntary market and entered the compliance market, something called the UK Emissions Trading Scheme standard, that again would likely push up the carbon price even further. So there are a lot of things coming together that may cause that price to go up. But if I had a crystal ball, you know, I would have betted against the pound last week. But you've got a lot of different things that you'd want to do. But generally the advice is not to sell everything up front, but if you sell some of it up front, then you can then reinvest that into new woodland creation schemes and generate even more carbon units, etc., etc. So, and there was one question saying, is this an annual payment? No, as I say, it's not a grant. And that question comes up all the time. A lot of people think that, but no, it's if you're going to earn 40 grand for a 10 hectare woodland, that will be a one-off.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. So my crystal ball says I'm retiring in 5 years and got 10 acres, 10 hectares out the back door there of grass. And my crystal ball says plant it up now, and then I'll get 40 grand to indulge my retirement with.
Right, I think.
Yes, thanks a lot, Andrew.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that chat. That's super. We'll move on now. Andy's going to do his short piece on the carbon
additionality side of things.
Additionality, yeah, sorry, my mind went blank there. And hopefully some of the questions that people have had in the chat about additionality and what sort of projects can I run and what can I actually do will come out in this. I'll keep trying to answer chat questions, but as I said, remember, some of them we will answer by email if you email us. Ewan, I can still see you, mate.
Oh, sorry.
You're welcome to stay on.
You're welcome to stay on. We'll be able to see you and hear you.
I'm gone. That'll improve your life no end, Chris.
Excellent. Okay, so over to you, Andy.
Good man, thanks, Chris. So yeah, I hope everyone can see this. I've seen Rupert, you've jumped out and jumped back in now, so hopefully your issues with your Mac might hopefully have been sorted. If not, as Chris says, this presentation is recorded and it will be sent around afterwards. So Woodland Carbon Code, additionality, the key thing. So as Emma introduced me, so I'm Andrew Baker. I work for Scottish Forestry, but specifically the Woodland Carbon Code team. So we're a small team, there's only 4 or 5 of us, and we govern the code for the rest of the UK. Good to see that you're back in, Rupert, and you can see everything. So I won't take too long. I'm looking at 10-15 minutes max, and then time for questions at the end, and then Chris will then have the same for his Woodland Carbon guarantee bit, and then we'll have 5-10 minutes. If we can let you go a little early, we will, but just by the number of questions coming through, we'll probably go all the way through till 12. So first of all, what am I going to be covering? So I'm going to be covering what the key principles about and around carbon offset units generally, not just additionality, it's just one of many. Looking at specifically then, what is additionality, to focus on that. Looking at the update we made in May this year, and a bit of a summary of the main changes that were made. Then looking at specifically for the English Woodland Creation offer, what sort of schemes will be able to still apply to the Woodland Carbon Code, and what changes may you have to make for new schemes coming forwards to adhere to the new rules or the updated rules. Quick run through the actual cash flow that has been updated in May this year, and then giving you time for questions, optimistically at 15 minutes, depending on how fast I can speak. So first of all, with the key principles about carbon units generally around PIUs, WCUs, because of course we're just one of many, many codes internationally. That being said, we are the only code alongside the Peatland Code in the UK that is endorsed by the UK government. So what that means is if I was a company and I was trying to make claims of carbon neutrality in my end of year greenhouse gas emissions reporting, which more and more companies are needing to do moving forwards, the only units I could use to formally offset my carbon emissions from the UK would be Peatland Code units, PCUs, like Peatland Carbon Units, or WCUs, Woodland Carbon Units. The PIUs you can get for both the Peatland Code and the Woodland Carbon Code are only you're buying those so that you can offset against future years' emissions, so you can't use those in your current inventory. Any other standard that's set up in the UK isn't endorsed by the UK government, and so you can't use them to offset your emissions. So, key principles. First of all, the credits themselves must be measurable. So for us, looking at trees, you can mensurate a woodland and see how much carbon is actually there. So it's a lot easier for us than it is for the Peatland Code guys. Bless them. So next of all, it must be a permanent removal of carbon emissions. And so the general international consensus on what permanent removal is 100 years. So if you removed a ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere for 100 years, then that's classed as permanent. There are some calls for that to be a lot longer, to say geological timeframes of 1,000, 10,000 years to be a permanent removal of carbon dioxide. And there are other claims to say, well, the climate emergency is the tightest for the next 20, 30 years. So surely that permanence should be less than 100 years. There are arguments on both sides. We're sticking to the international consensus on that for 100 years. It must be verifiable by a third party, an independent third party. So we've got both the Soil Association and Organic Farmers and Growers at the minute that are our validators and verifiers. And we've got other organisations looking to come into that space as well, just to reduce the burden on those two, because I think they're a bit swamped at the minute. And finally, it must be additional. Now I'll come on to what that is on the next slide, but all 4 of these and many other pillars, but these are the key 4, build into the credibility of these carbon units. And it's crucial to remember that the only reason these units have any value at all is because companies looking to become carbon neutral are buying them because they trust the credibility of the units, and they believe that their contribution, their payments, are leading to genuine, real removals of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, additionality goes one step further. It's essentially asking, essentially is asking that investment from the company is leading to additional carbon being removed from the atmosphere than would have happened otherwise. So there are a lot of schemes that are getting full grant support, very heavily timber focused, that are on very poor quality land, that we're saying, look, they would have gone ahead anyway. You don't need carbon finance to go ahead. And we judge this in a variety of different ways, but I'm probably getting a bit ahead of myself. First and foremost, it's saying, what is business as usual? And if that scheme is within that business as usual category, then we're not going to give you carbon units because you don't need it. You're going to do it anyway. It's the schemes that wouldn't have been planted otherwise that we're trying to support. Now, as you can imagine, that's fiendishly difficult to do. And additionality as a concept is something every carbon standard struggles with internationally. So the updated rules we've made have made it so that hopefully it's more predictable and quantifiable and comparable between different schemes. Now, there are over 20 recognised ways of assessing additionality. I think that's almost over 30 now as well. But we only focus on two, the legal test and the financial test. So essentially what we're looking at in both of those, the legal test, do you have a legal requirement to plant that woodland? So for instance, if you'd cut down 1 hectare of woodland to build a new road and you are having to legally plant another hectare elsewhere as compensatory planting, whether we give you carbon units to sell or not isn't going to lead to any more woodland creation. You're going to have to plant that woodland regardless. Our intervention means nothing, so you're not additional. The financial additionality test is far more difficult because we're having to assess what the threshold, what the point is that people would go ahead with planting a woodland and what is not going to happen. So what we're asking in the financial additionality test isn't, are you making money from the woodland creation scheme? And if you are, you're not additional, because that in reality won't work. Because if I'm a farmer, I've got 10 hectares of land and I'm making on average £1,000 per hectare per year. And then someone says, oh, if you plant woodland, you'll make £20 per hectare per year. Well, you're not going to do it because the income you're going to have to forego, you're going to be losing a huge amount of money to then plant the woodland. So what we're comparing in our additionality test, and I'll show you this in a minute in the cash flow itself, what we're comparing is the business as usual scenario. How much money are you currently making normally from farming as a net present value? So let's say you're on a £500,000 is your net present value for your farm, and the woodland creation scenario without any carbon funding, just on its own merit, with grant funding, with timber returns, if that's making £400,000, well, we'll say, okay, well, we see you're having to take a hit financially, you are additional, you can have carbon credits. If your current land use is £500,000 and the woodland without carbon is £1 million, well, we'd say, well, it makes economic sense to plant the woodland anyway. You don't need us. You're just being greedy is the sort of principle. You're going to plant it anyway. So that's kind of the basis of the financial additionality. So an important point to remember is you can make money from the woodland creation scheme without carbon. That's fine, so long as you're not making more money than you already are. That is the principle. It's a bit messy, but hopefully it'll be clearer as we go through the cash flow later on. So we did an update in May this year to help the additionality calculator, make it easier, more predictable, more standardized, more consistent. But one of the other things we did was remove test 2 and test 4. So we used to have 4 ways of assessing additionality. And it was only this week that we've formally removed the test 2 and test 4. Now, test 2, you don't need to worry about. That was essentially just an assessment of the amount of grant support you were getting, but it didn't really work in practice. So we got rid of it. And test 4 was a barrier test, saying, is there anything that was not an economic factor that was limiting the woodland going ahead, and woodland creation carbon units, would they help overcome that non-economic factor? But the fact that the carbon units themselves are a financial instrument made it quite a difficult one to justify. So we'll see where that goes. In the future, it may be decided that we bring that back, but generally the barrier test is more for developing countries who need, they say, okay, well, on paper, this looks like it's going to be financially viable on its own. We don't need carbon, but terrorism, war, corrupt government, it means that it's not likely to actually come to fruition. So there's this extra barrier in place that we need to overcome. As I say, remove both of those. So I don't know why I mentioned them. You don't have to worry about them. It's only test the legal test and the financial test that you have to worry about now. We've also clarified a lot of guidance on stacking and bundling carbon credits with other sources of income. So as was asked earlier, can you have grant support? Absolutely fine, so long as you still pass that financial additionality test. What about biodiversity credits? What about nitrate credits? Can you stack and bundle all of these different ecosystem services together? Well, stacking in of itself is saying, okay, I'll have a carbon credit, I'll have a biodiversity credit, I'll have a nitrate credit, all on top of one another. That's stacking. Bundling is where you have one credit that accounts for all of those different things. So at the moment, that's kind of how our woodland carbon units work. They're charismatic carbon. It's not carbon just on its own. As Emma explained, you've got the economic benefits, you've got the biodiversity, the water benefits, all supporting that carbon unit and all being scored in a different way. So you can see how a carbon unit with 5 out of 5 biodiversity, 5 out of 5 water ratings would sell for a far higher price than one that had 1 or 2. So we've clarified the guidance there, essentially saying, look, in theory, all of these different, you can bundle these different income sources together, so long as you don't fail our legal and financial additionality tests. What does this mean for biodiversity credits in particular for England? It depends on how the biodiversity credit guys go about it. They may say that there's a legal requirement to do this, and therefore you would fail our legal additionality test, or they may not. So watch this space, but in my personal, humble opinion, it's unlikely they're going to be able to be stacked. So you're unlikely to be able to generate biodiversity credits, sell those to one person, woodland carbon units, sell those to another company. It's more likely that you'll have to go for one or the other, but that may change. And then we've updated the financial additionality cash flow, which I will show to you after talking about the UCO projects. So for UCO in particular, essentially what we're addressing, and you'll see in the cash flow in a moment, is how much money are you currently making and how much money are you going to be making from a woodland creation scenario without carbon. If you're getting so much money from a grant scheme and from timber that it looks as though it's a financially viable option in its own right, you first and foremost, you can just crack on and plant that, fail your additionality with the carbon code and not worry about the carbon code, just going through a regular woodland creation scheme. This isn't compulsory in any way. But if you do want to access the woodland carbon code and have your project be additional and be accepted, then you have a couple of options. First one is to reduce your grant support. If we're saying, well, you're making £500,000 currently from your farming, you're making £600,000 based on your grant support and your timber returns, well, just knock your grant support down and then you can go under the threshold, you're there for an additional scheme. And in UCO, there are discussions about how effectively and efficiently we can allow applicants to drop different elements of their grant, because it's quite unheard of in the past. People are very good at knowing how they can maximise grant, and the grant schemes are set up for that purpose. Reducing grant, well, that's a bit more challenging sometimes. Sometimes the computer systems even are in such a way they're quite restricted as to what they can do. So just to give you a bit of advice as to the different ways you can reduce your grant support, if that's something you wanted to do, is remove the extra capital items like roading, where you get 40% contribution. Reduce or remove your additional contributions, which can be enormous in the UCO. You could be getting £5 worth per hectare of standard items. You can get another £5 nearly worth of additional contributions based on the additional contributions that your scheme provides. So reduce those, knock those back, absolutely fine. You've also got maintenance payments for 10 years. You can reduce or remove those. And then you've got the standard items. And so you can talk about removing the fencing or the supply and plant a tree sort of payments. But again, this starts becoming a little bit more difficult for the grant teams themselves, but it is doable. And then the second thing you can look at is altering your species composition. So if you've got a 70% Sitka spruce scheme that you're trying to push through with grant support, without grant support, whatever, we may say that you're going to have to drop that down a bit and become more varied as a planting design in of itself, because you're going to be making too much money from the Sitka spruce element. I know the whole idea of this goes against everything as foresters were taught to do in terms of adjusting species compositions and grant support in a way that we never normally have before, but this is adhering to international carbon standards, so that's why it's a bit different than normal. So now I just wanted to have a quick look at the cash flow itself. So I hope this has just popped up okay, and you can all see this. Chris, tell me if you can't see this and I'll have a play. So first and foremost, you can.
Yeah. You
Brilliant.
might want to share your whole screen.
Oh, they're not showing the whole screen. Give me a second. Get off of that and then bring that up. And there. Is that all right, Chris? Can you see that okay?
I think that's going to be fine.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So this is the updated 2.2 additionality, financial additionality spreadsheet for the Woodland Carbon Code. And first and foremost, just to explain how much easier we've made it to calculate, what you used to have to do is if you had a 100-year project, you'd have to fill out this section. So you'd have to go in for every single year, for every different type of cost and every different type of income, you'd have to put in the amount of money you were likely to make. And so you'd have to go through the whole 100 years and fill out all of these cells. So you could imagine, not only is that fiendishly difficult for a landowner who doesn't have a huge amount of experience in forestry perhaps, or even experienced foresters to do that over 100 years, predicting what's going to happen in the future markets and that sort of thing. It was incredibly difficult. And then you've got both us and the validators having to go through all of these documents and check and cross-reference against other similar types of projects. It just wasn't feasible. And so what we've done is we've made it so that you simply have to enter your information for your project in this page, and then it automatically generates values for how much it's going to cost to do all your fencing, how much it's going to you're going to be getting back from timber from a Sitka spruce plantation, for instance, whatever it may be. And so with standardization, there's always going to be a loss in accuracy. That's just the way it is. But one approach we could have taken for additionality was saying, right, simply put, only broadleaf schemes allowed, no conifers, or only schemes with no grant support allowed and no schemes with grant support. But we felt that wasn't as refined or as sophisticated as we would like it to be, because it is so tricky to assess additionality, financial additionality in the UK. So this is hopefully a bit of a halfway house between saying, you know, we'll do a very project specific approach for every project, look through every bank statement, every invoice that we simply don't have the capacity to do, versus just red listing schemes and saying, if you get any grant support, if you've got any conifer, you're out, which we didn't want to do either. So this is a bit of a compromise as best we could. So bear with us. And this is going to be updated annually with improved or updated prices and that sort of thing. But the fundamental principle of how we assess additionality is not going to be changing for a very long time. We're very happy with this. We've had fantastic feedback from the carbon markets internationally. So we're sticking with this for the long run. So all you do, as you can see, is enter the information for your project. And so you put in how much fencing you've put in, what roads you're expecting to build over the course of the project, and how much site preparation, ground prep you had to do, the number of hectares for each, the amount of the area of different species that you're planting, etc., etc. And then you also put in your grant income. And this is really important because this is where, for a 100-hectare Sitka scheme, just to give you an example, this is me under UCO taking all standard items for the 100-hectare scheme, yet not taking any additional contributions and reducing my grant payments down for 5 years rather than 10 years. And what this does is this then generates, and then you also import your carbon values based on the calculator that Emma showed to you, and also the existing land use. So you put down which category of land the land was currently in. And then it feeds all of this through into the cash flow and through some Excel wizardry. And then it comes through to the results page and it says this scheme is passing. Now, if I'd taken, just for instance, 10 years worth of grant support, this would then, so if I took my full grant, maintenance grant, and took all the capital items, it would fail but it would fail. So we'd essentially say to you, you're going to have to either drop your Sitka proportion down, essentially, or commercial conifer down a bit, but more likely just drop your grant support down slightly and drop that down to 5 or 6 years or whatever it may be, and then you've then you pass and you're an additional scheme. And it represents here how much support you're getting financially from different sources. You've got your timber is providing 50% returns, 25% is from the carbon units, and 25% is from the grant support, just so that investors can really see how much or how important their investment into the scheme is. So that is it. Whereas before, as I say, you had to go through the whole cash flow. This, I think it's hard to argue that it's not going to be a lot easier. I think everyone can agree it's easier, it's simpler to do, but you can imagine there's a lot of concern that what about our figures, because forestry is hugely different across the country. Prices for fencing changes enormously from one to another. UN NPV is simply just net present value, so essentially it takes all of the incomes and costs for the whole 100 years, discounts them back to today, and says, okay, £50,000 worth of income in 30 years time from a clear fell is worth £10,000 today, or something like that. So it gives you can compare projects of different durations to one another. That is it from me, and I'll open up to questions now. I know there might be, I can see the chat is trundling along nicely.
The chat's gone mad since we started. Additionality, surprise.
It's never a good sign. It shows that I'm not explaining things as well as I could. But Chris, do you want to pick out?
It's not that you're not explaining it. Kate Winters again had a question about, I'm trying to scroll to find it. How can you make money from sitka spruce felling if it negates the credits?
How can you make money from sitka spruce if felling negates the credits? So there's something that we see as Emma described, something called a clear fell cap. So if you had a project over 100 years and you're going to clear fell all the trees at year 33, this comes into that permanence question. It's quite a contentious part of the code as well. But if you're going to generate 600 units, if you didn't clear fell over the whole 100 years, but you have sequestered carbon for 33 years and then you've clear felled, then you've immediately replanted and you're getting multiple rotations, ignore all material substitution and harvested wood products for now. I'm just looking in the forest itself. There's something known as a time volume ratio. So what we're saying is 600 units for 100 years is essentially equivalent to 200 units for 33 years. So for the length of the scheme, we will give you 200 units. That's in a nutshell how the clear fell cap works. Now, there are a lot of calls from some companies saying you shouldn't allow any intervention, any thinning, any clear fell at all. And then there are other people saying that, well, no, because the benefits you get from harvested wood products, from displacing steel and concrete, which have far higher carbon emission factors than timber, you should be saying everyone should be clear felling and thinning. So this is a way in which we're trying to, again, rock in a hard place, but we're trying to be a fair compromise. And this is the way international schemes also do it. The precedent internationally is that you reduce the number of units down, but you can still assign units. And this comes into some of the questions earlier on as well about coppicing and short rotation forestry and that sort of thing. We apply similar sorts of caps, but that is more of a dark art than the sitka spruce year 35 felling rotational forestry. So if you have any specific questions about short rotation forestry and coppicing, please let me know and just drop me an email.
Thanks, Andy. The last one before I talk, I think, is Sarah Ratcliffe says, if you fail the cash flow spreadsheet, can you still get your scheme validated?
Not by us, unless you were to adjust your spreadsheet in the way I
But I
described
was about
in terms
to like
of yeah. Yeah, so it's not as though you fill it out once and then you're out for good, never talk to us again. It is very much, if you have failed, then you've tried to, and you're willing to reduce your grant payments down or willing to alter your species composition, then yeah, you can alter it and you can change it to make it pass, which is, again, quite contentious at times, but that's the reality of it. So you can do that. But if you chose not to, if you said, no, this is the scheme that I'm submitting, I don't care that it fails, then no, you can't validate through it. You have to pass the test to be able to be validated through the Woodland Carbon Code.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to take Anna Kane's question, and then move on, I think, to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. Then we'll have some time for questions as well. And Anna says, so So you need to fill in the cash flow sheet after applying for UCO, but before accepting a UCO agreement. Is that and so you can change the amount if the grant fails the sheet. My if my take on this is, if you're registering for the Woodland Carbon Code, do it as soon as you know you're going to want to plant. So register the land. We expect there to be changes in the both the design and the carbon sequestration during the period of firming up an agreement and getting your EIA sorted out. So as far as UCO is concerned, register as soon as you know you're going to plant. Andy, for when do you need to fill out the cash flow?
So the process is registration, do the work, then you validate. And it's at that validation point that you assess additionality. Now, because we've got the spreadsheet standardized and it's unlikely to change much year on year, it's just going to be updates to the costs and incomes. You should be able to, at point of registration, even pre-registration, have a play and fill out this spreadsheet and see whether your scheme is likely to pass. So if you then submit, think, okay, well, to pass, I can't have any more than £5,000 per hectare grant support through UCO. That's what the additionality calculator is telling me. And it's going to take a year or two for me to finally plan and validate, but it gives you a rough estimate. When you apply to UCO, then you can submit your application to UCO, and then as you're planting the scheme, after you've planted, you can reduce claims down, you can play with your UCO agreement slightly. Now, the UCO team will hate me saying this, and this is an area that I'm not an expert in for sure, but there are variations that are naturally outside of the Woodland Carbon Code going to happen from the point of your UCO application throughout planting anyway. You might plant a smaller area, you might plant different species, fence a different area, etc. So they have the capacity within UCO to adjust the grant agreement post-planting. And if you need to do that at that validation stage, then that's absolutely fine.
Okay, that's super. I can't type, look and speak at the same time. I'm just
we'll come back to the rest of these questions at the end. So if Chris does this his presentation, and then I'll be able to be answering these in the chat whilst Chris is presenting. Not that I'm not listening attentively to your presentation, Chris.
Yeah, but me too. That's what I was doing.
I'll leave it to you, Chris. Over to you now.
Thanks a lot. Now I'm going to talk about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. Just find my presentation, share the screen, and if you could just tell me, is that working?
All good, all good.
All good, excellent. Right, so I'm the Carbon and Water Advisor. I've been furiously trying to answer questions on the chat. Hopefully I've managed to get a lot of them answered. I work for the Forestry Commission for England, and so I'll talk a bit about the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. It was mentioned in the 25-year environment plan and in ETAP that we would be using it, developing it, and having auctions using the Woodland Carbon Guarantee for 5 years from 2019 when it was launched. It was, as I say, it was announced in the 2018 budget and launched in 2019, primarily to drive forward woodland creation, but also to drive and develop the private sector market for woodland carbon. And the next auction is coming up in November 2022. That will be our 6th auction. And in order to be able to enter that auction, you need to have registered your Woodland Carbon Code project with the Woodland Carbon Code team by the end of this month. I'll give you the specific dates later, but it's really important if you're thinking of doing a Woodland Carbon Guarantee scheme, you need to have registered. And registration only requires you to have put in your name, a map and grid reference for the site, and an estimate of the amount of carbon that your project might sequester. And you can do that by doing a rough calculation on the Woodland Carbon calculator, and then submitting it into the Woodland Carbon Code team. And the Woodland Carbon Guarantee is one of our incentives. It is one of the Forestry Commission's incentives in England. And I should have said it only works across England. Apologies to those Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh listeners, but it only works in England. It's not a grant. It provides you with an additional income stream once you've planted, and for the 35 years between now and net zero in 2050. We had a £50 million budget, and we anticipate being able to offer auctions for a 4 to 5 year period from 2019. As I say, it's a guaranteed contract at a price agreed at the beginning of the process, which rises with inflation. No, sorry, rises with the CPI, which is the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, and it. So it is. It hopefully, I know inflation is not what it used to be, but it is supposed to be inflation proofed. All projects must be validated and verified under the Woodland Carbon Code, and they must be registered to the Woodland Carbon Code before the auction. It's available in addition to existing grants, so you can apply for this and apply for UCO as long as you can prove that your project is going to be additional. And the Woodland Carbon Guarantee rather is accessed via a reverse auction process. And a reverse auction is where the buyer of the product pays the lowest price possible. Talking about eligibility, but it's probably best to look at ineligible land. You can't include land which is covered by a statutory requirement to establish a woodland or restock a woodland. If it is not entirely within England, you cannot apply. And where the participant or applicant doesn't have management control for the length of the agreement, and that length of agreement is 35 years, and it's unable to have an application countersigned by the landowner. Obviously, the reverse of that makes you eligible if you do have management control, and you can for a length of period, and you can provide a countersigned application by the owner, then you will be eligible. And land that is owned by public bodies is not eligible. Public bodies there means central government public bodies. Local authority country farmland is or county farmland is normally tenanted out and can be eligible, but it's best to seek advice if you are a local authority and you need to you want or are interested in joining the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, then it's best to seek the Woodland Carbon Guarantee's team's advice on whether your land would be eligible. What's the process? Well, register with the Woodland Carbon Code. Then you apply for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. Go on the website, search Woodland Carbon Guarantee, and you will be brought to a web page on gov.uk which says this is how to apply. You participate in the auction, submitting your price for a tonne of carbon, and you are either successful or not successful. We will let you know at that time when the auction happens as to whether we will have an agreement with you. You need to validate the woodland planting. So you implement your project and you validate it under the Woodland Carbon Code. And you verify your project. And that verification period, and there was some discussion in the chat about verification periods, but verification periods for the Woodland Carbon Code can be 5 years, 10 years, or even once at the end of the programme or at the end of your agreement. Just depends on how you want to receive your income. And again, it's an option. It is an option to sell to the government. If you've got a woodland carbon guarantee agreement with the Forestry Commission, what that is saying is that we must buy from you, but you don't have to sell to us. If the price for WCUs, when you come to selling them to the government, is way more than you would get from your sale of units under the Woodland Carbon Guarantee, then by all means sell in the private market. The government, though, if you come to us and say, I want to sell my units to you at the price we agreed plus inflation on way back in 2022, then we must purchase from you. The auction 6 parameters for this time around, we've got a £10 million budget and it's split 50-50 between 2 auction types. I'll go into those in a minute. There is a reserve price, but we don't publish it. And there will be 2 different reserve prices for those different auctions. It's about the removal. Well, obviously, we in order to keep the project and the auctions competitive, we remove a maximum of the top 10% of WCUs by price, so that there is competition between those submitting to the auction. And there is a list of eligible species given on the website on gov.uk that you can use in your application. There are 2 different auction types. One is for predominantly native woodland, where at least 60% of the net area of the planting comprises native woodland as defined in the Ancient and Native Woodland Practice Guide, and that requires that a minimum of 80% of the canopy comprises native species, of which 20% can be near native or naturalised, but they must be planted in a design that's sympathetic to native woodland, and 20% of other species can be planted obviously in a design sympathetic to native woodland within that 60%. Up to 40% of the rest of the net area can be other woodland and still leave you with a predominantly native woodland. So that's one type of the auction. The other type is going to be the non-native, maybe commercial woodlands, which are planted according to UKFS and will be in the auction, which is entitled Other. Okay. So the auction dates, here we go. Application deadline for auction 6 is it's 23:59 on Sunday the 6th of November. That's when you must have registered with the Woodland Carbon Code and registered with the auction. The auction takes place between the 21st and 27th of November, and that's when you submit your price for your tonne of carbon. And auction 7 is planned for May 2023. Recently, and in our past auctions, you can see there a set of prices and how successful people have been. We started off in January 2020 with an auction price of £24.11. There's been some fluctuation. Auction 5, at which there were 15 successful bids, had an average price of £23.70. But please, that is just the average price of auctions that have gone before. That is not a firm indicator of what acceptable bids might be, and there may be some leeway up or down from that figure. So, any questions? I am actually going to come off sharing now and rejoin you with Andy.
Yeah, we've got plenty, Chris. You'll be happy to know. So, first of all, there was a question specifically about, does the management, so this is from Hugh, does the management control clause for 35 years mean you can't sell the land during that time? Now, I know you mentioned another project, another sort of question earlier on, but I thought you could just elaborate.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I get a bit of feedback. It's not that you can't sell the land, you just have to be able to show that the person who is purchasing it also has control over that land for the next 35 years, and you'd sell the project, I suppose, to them as well. The Woodland Carbon Code projects travel with the land, not the owner.
Brilliant. Ewan has asked, what controls are in place to prevent woodlands created as a result of biodiversity net gain or nutrient neutrality do not from Woodland Carbon Code, Woodland Carbon Guarantee? So it's saying what controls are in place to prevent them?
Yeah, okay. Well, we're very careful about this, Ewan, and it's a good question. It's one of those ones in stacking. We are there is a small amount of leeway within this, where Woodland Carbon Code projects can register if they are the result of a development control decision, but only if there was a choice in the habitat that was created. My feeling is, and I think the sort of other considered opinion is, that biodiversity net gain will require that if you destroy one habitat, you recreate or try to, as best you can, recreate that habitat. If you are given a choice, then it's a voluntary action-ish to create a new woodland. And if you're not specified to do so. So woodland creation that develops, that is created from development, can squeeze in, but only if it passes the legal test. And biodiversity net gain units created from woodland creation. Well, I'm not entirely sure yet that we are able to say that you can create biodiversity net gain units from woodland creation. That's the result of a planning or some sort of compliance issue. Certainly, it'd be very difficult to get them past Andy.
You can try. One question, Chris, one of your favourite topics, tax with the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. Sorry, I've been scrolling up. Is the Woodland Carbon Guarantee payment taxable?
The payments from Woodland Carbon in general are treated as woodland as income from any other source of income from I can't speak at the moment, from an actively managed woodland. So it's exempt from income tax at the moment. I can only say at the moment because Who knows what taxes will appear next week or the week after or in the budget. But at the moment, a working woodland meeting the definition of, or woodland meeting the definition of a working woodland is exempt from income tax. So carbon payments that are made are exempt from income tax.
Excellent. There's one question from Rupert quite a bit earlier. Imagine where sites are sold at some point where there are issues requiring the new owner to sign up, even if all carbon units are sold early on. I'll just jump on this myself, if that's all right, Chris. Just this is an important thing, and I know you've covered it in the chat already, essentially saying, look, if you have a woodland creation scheme under the Woodland Carbon Code and you sell that land, as Chris says, the obligation follows the land, not the landowner, so long as they do or they have to do within their commitment statement at the start in their contract, saying I will manage this woodland as per the Woodland Carbon Code management plan and their rules, and I will also make sure that I inform future landowners they must adhere to this. So if they haven't sold any carbon units, they can either sell the land and hold on to those carbon units and take those with them, or they can sell the land with those carbon units sat with that land parcel as well. So you're almost as a new buyer, you're buying an asset in those carbon units. But if you look at it as they've already sold all of their carbon units and you're buying a scheme and you don't have any carbon units, all you're buying are the obligations and the liability of the Woodland Carbon Code, then a lot of people would say, well, then it's massively going to devalue land. Potentially. But I mentioned earlier about if your woodland is growing better than expected, particularly with natural regeneration. So we give you very few, if any, pending issuance units up front. So we're already incredibly conservative with the number of units we'll give to you up front. So even though Chris said a mixed broadleaf scheme often generates about 400 units, some of the better ones with higher yield classes, 6, 8, that sort of thing, they can be generating 600, 650 units by the end of the 100 years per hectare. We won't give all of those to you up front because we're conservative. We'll only give you about 60, 70% of those units up front. And so because of that, we'll only give you drip feed those extra units as you prove to us at each verification, look, my trees are growing far better than expected. It's actually your class 10 or whatever it may be. At that verification, we will give that project more units. So if you've sold the land and you've moved on and you've sold 400 of those 650 units, the new landowner can be benefiting from those extra drip fed units moving forwards. With the increase predicted in the price of carbon units to the hundreds of pounds per unit, even another 10, 20 units or so per verification per hectare can make a significant difference. So I like to just, particularly just in the round, coming back to the question about how small a scheme should you plant in terms of and register with the Woodland Carbon Code, my advice would be, as much as I can advise, which I shouldn't really, so what I would do is I would register every woodland with the Woodland Carbon Code, no matter its size. If I had to draw a line at it, I'd say half a hectare or something like that, because it doesn't cost anything. The cost of validation, particularly if you group it together with other schemes, can be incredibly low. See what happens with the carbon price. You're not bound by anything until you start selling your carbon units. So register your scheme, have it go through the planting process, and once you get to that validation, you can go through the validation process, get your units assigned to you and sit on them for a few years and see what happens. If you decide that it's not for you, give the units back and you're out of the scheme. That's all that will happen. So when it comes to the minimum size, as I say, for me, there isn't really a minimum size. In terms of actual eligibility into the code, it's about 0.1 hectare because it has to be able to be classed as a woodland. And there are different definitions as to how wide a woodland should be and that sort of thing. But under the code, we just take the view of 1.1 hectare to be the smallest it can be. So that was me just jumping in there, Chris. There's another couple of messages. Chris, so this is from Andrew Weatherall. Chris, native woodland, well explained. I didn't see the same detail for the other, which is 50% of total offer. Is it just, someone else? Is it just UKFS compliant is enough for other?
Other, yeah. I didn't explain that because I think I jumped a slide. The other category is has to be UKFS compliant. it has to, therefore, it can be commercial woodland. It can have, but it has to have that compliance with the UKFS. It can be, sort of your normal commercial woodland planting, which can sign up to the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. There isn't as much detail. That's the long and the short of it, Andy. The other is for other species that are not predominantly native woodlands.
I'm just looking more just further back just to make sure that we've not missed anything. I think we have missed a few, but I'm just aware of time. So we've got one from encourage tree planting on fertile. Oh yeah, so Regina there. Does the carbon scheme possibly encourage tree planting on fertile agricultural land used for crops, vegetables, etc.? Very important question about food versus forestry. You'd have to be making a lot of money from forestry to dislodge farming, particularly at the moment with the current sales and prices of agricultural crops. That being said, with the prediction in carbon prices that I keep touting by 2030, if we were to get to that point where you're making tens of thousands of pounds per hectare from carbon, not to mention the timber returns and grant support from forestry more generally, yes, it might start threatening that food security. But it's not a major concern for us because it's a very simple thing that we could introduce. We could simply say, not forestry, we don't have the authority to say forestry can't be planted on grade 1 agricultural land, but we can say that woodland carbon code projects aren't allowed on incredibly high agricultural land. If that was to start happening, it's not really happening at the moment. There may be a few very, very small cases that people are predicting on huge returns from carbon in the future, but for now, it's not really happening. But if it did, there are measures we can put in place very easily to prevent it happening more widespread. Okay, time is the enemy. So I think that is about it for us. Can local authorities in Scotland register under the Woodland and peatland codes? Yes, I think they can, but it's only classed as meeting guests, so I don't know who you are. So feel free to email me. Speaking of which, Chris, if you and I both put our email addresses into the chat or into the feedback.
Whilst you're writing, and then I'll write. But Ewan, yeah, neutrality does seem to be moving towards woodland creation as a favoured route. That's brilliant, but the polluter pays principle still applies, and so therefore, while we would expect people to be putting, sort of UKFS compliant woodland in, they have to pay the full price of doing that. They can't receive grants for it, and they shouldn't. Just for other, as with other, sort of destruction of habitat, let's say, they shouldn't be able to benefit from the destruction of habitat through creation of another thing which earns them money. So that's the principle that applies, but it's proving difficult to convince everybody that that's the way we should be running.
Brilliant. Chris, one quick question about sharing slides after the presentation. I wanted to ask, are you or Emma going to be emailing everyone round with the recording and with the slides and with our contact details, or just want to confirm?
I think, yeah, we will do. We'll put a link to the recording in, and we will attach the slides as well, and then our email addresses.
Mm-hmm. There was one question I just wanted to touch on. I know we're out of time, but Oliver, if you have a buyer for PRUs at a higher price than defaults in the cash flow, can those be used? No, but it's not a problem because in our financial additionality test at the moment, this may change in the future, but at the moment, the income you're going to receive from carbon credits, from the sale of carbon credits, is essentially irrelevant to the additionality test, the financial additionality test. So if I had a business as usual, £500,000 MPV versus my forestry without carbon at £400,000, you would pass additionality because we're saying that you're making more money now than you would from a forestry scenario. Whether you make £10 or £10,000 or £100,000 from the carbon income, it's not going to affect the additionality assessment. That figure isn't relevant to our assessment. So as I say, it's purely looking at both non-carbon scenarios to be able to assess what you would do with that land. I know that's a bit of a confusing principle, but if you do have any more questions, please just let me know. Everyone knows how they're going, so thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for attending, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, everyone. Speak to you later.
Bye.
Bye.